Firstly, I apologize that this turned out to be such a long video, but please watch it till the end, you're gonna learn a lot. We're gonna cover a plethora of interesting topics and learn a bunch of theory. The main topics that we will deal with are socialism versus communism, what is the role of money, are there classes in socialism, the transitional period, the Paris Commune and was Marx a centralist or a decentralist, Lassalleanism, socialism in one country and the international revolution, and finally, the socialist state. Alright, let's get to it. Hello comrades, it's the Finnish Bolshevik. This time we're gonna be taking a look at a video by CuckPhilosophy called Marx Was Not a Quote-Unquote Statist. Every now and then you see people who try to reinterpret Marx. They'll read Marx and then they'll say, oh well, this is what Marx said, but it's not actually what he said. Or everything you know about Marx is wrong, and in reality, Marx meant something completely different than what people think. And this video is about if Marx was a statist, so if Marx wanted a state. But it's a little bit of a strange question, because if somebody is an anti-statist, then that means that they want the state to go away. If they're a statist, that means that they support a state. But Marxism is a little different, because Marxism sees the state as a historical phenomena, like the state arises because there are conditions that give rise to it, there's a reason why the state exists, but the state will not exist for all time. It's a temporary historical phenomena. So, if somebody asks me, is Marx a statist? Well, I mean, not really, but I also wouldn't call him an anti-statist. Both of those are very misleading. I suppose in the grand scheme of things, Marx would be against the state. But then again, in most of these statist versus anti-statist debates, Marx ended up on the statist side. So I think the whole question is misleading, but let's just take a look at the video and then we'll talk about the details.
There is a very common assumption propagated all over the political spectrum, both by Marxists and anti-Marxists, that for Marx, socialism is about state control, or at the very least presupposes state control. And this isn't that surprising. After all, in the Communist Manifesto, the most widely read Marx and Engels text, Marx lists 10 measures to be done immediately after the working class seizes state power, and these involve massive nationalization and strict centralization. Obviously, this can't be done without the heavy involvement of a state. But before we tackle this, let's rewind a little bit back for the beginners, and start with what at least most Marxists already agree on. For Marx, the state is something that must eventually be abolished. After all, communism is a classless, moneyless, and stateless society. However, so the common narrative goes, before the state can be abolished, it must first be seized by the working class, utilized to establish socialism, and once communism is on the horizon, the state will naturally wither away.
Well, technically the workers should overthrow and destroy the bourgeois state and replace it with their own state, not simply recreate a bourgeois state.
So this is the common narrative that you have likely seen before. First, you have capitalism, markets, the state, classes, all that. Then, socialism emerges when workers take power. Under socialism, you still have the state and classes, but with the working class, rather than the capitalist class, being in power.
In socialism, the capitalist class wouldn't really exist. At least not in the way that we usually think of a capitalist class. You might have people who are illegally working in the black market trying to be capitalists. You might have people who want to become capitalist or wish they could be capitalists. And you might have capitalists in surrounding countries, foreign capitalists. But you wouldn't really have a capitalist class existing and doing capitalist things in a socialist country.
Finally, once the bourgeoisie have been defeated, classes, money, and the state will finally disappear, and we have communism. This is an extremely common narrative, but it is not Marx's narrative.
I would argue that it is more or less Marx's narrative, but I suppose we'll get into the specifics later.
We should point out that Marx never distinguished between socialism and communism. in the sense that the former comes first and the latter comes after. He didn't use the word socialism that often, preferring to use communism. And when he did use it, he usually used it interchangeably with communism, as they were generally used interchangeably in the socialist theory of his time. The only times that Marx or Engels actually distinguished socialism from communism was when they used socialism to refer to socialist tendencies they were against.
That's technically true, but it's used in a bit of a misleading way. Communism is a French word. I think it probably comes from the French utopians. Socialism is a German word, so they obviously have different origins. They meant something sort of similar, so they were used a little bit interchangeably at the time. For example, Marx calls the utopians critical utopian socialists or critical utopian communists, so he doesn't make a distinction there. But yes, Marx and Engels thought that communism was a better term, so they called themselves communists, the Communist Manifesto, and so on. But this idea that socialism is an earlier stage, and then communism is the second stage that comes after that, and that socialism is like a transition, and communism is the end goal, that idea still comes from Marx, even if the terminology was a little different. So these days we would call the earlier stage socialism. And I think that this probably comes from Lenin's State and Revolution. I don't know if that's the absolute first place where this was used, but at least Lenin in State and Revolution calls the earlier stage socialism, and he calls the latter stage communism. Marx also made a distinction between the earlier stage and the final stage, but he called them both communism. He just called the earlier stage lower communism, or lower phase communism, or lower stage communism, and he called the final stage full communism, or the higher phase of communism, or the higher stage of communism. So this idea that there is an earlier stage where the workers have already taken over the means of production, the factories, the workplaces, and that there is a later stage where the state withers away, this still all comes from Marx. The only difference is that Marx didn't call the first stage socialism, he called it lower stage communism.
There is, of course, one significant distinction Marx did make in Critique of the Gotha program, where he distinguished between lower phase communism and higher phase communism. In the lower phase, people must work for labor vouchers. These are not the same as money because they cannot be accumulated, kind of like a movie ticket. You use it once and then it's rendered invalid. Because labor vouchers cannot be accumulated, they cannot be turned into capital, hence not capitalist. These labor vouchers can then be used in exchange for various products. In other words, lower phase communism still contains material incentives for work, as the amount of labor vouchers you receive depends on the number of hours you've worked. Once society reaches a sufficient level of development, productivity increases to the point of abundance, and people have become fully socialized into this new form of social life, we have entered the higher phase of communism. Labor vouchers are no longer necessary and are replaced by the principle from each according to ability to each according to need.
It's not so much that they simply can't be accumulated, because you could still accumulate stuff. So what if you can't actually accumulate the paper vouchers? You could still buy tons of consumer objects, what Marx calls means of consumption. Furniture, cans of beans, bottles of water. Sure, if it's food, it'll eventually go bad, but there's still plenty of things that you could accumulate. And even if you could accumulate labor vouchers, the actual paper, all you can do with it is get consumer products or services. And that's the real point. The point of these labor vouchers is that you can't use them to buy means of productions. You can't use them for any capitalistic activities, no matter how many vouchers you had. They can only be earned through work, and you can't invest them, so you can't use them to exploit somebody else's work. Quote, "No one can give anything except his labor, and, on the other hand, nothing can pass to the ownership of individuals except individual means of consumption." Unquote.
Later, as popularized by Lenin, the lower phase of communism was termed socialism, and higher phase communism was termed simply communism. But note that whether we're talking about the lower phase or the higher phase, it is still moneyless because money is replaced with labor vouchers. If it's moneyless, it is also classless, because without money, there is no class that owns all the capital and uses it to wield power over the rest of society, and therefore stateless, because for Marxists, a state is merely the means by which one class exerts its power over subordinate classes.
So the first question that really has to be answered is, what is money? Since this system is supposed to be moneyless, what is money? Well, you could say that money is something you use for exchange, but then you would have to ask, well, what is exchange? And I feel like the term exchange itself is already very complicated. But let's roll with that for a second. In lower phase communism, or socialism, what you use the labor vouchers for, the little pieces of paper, you work, you earn them, then you go to the store, the publicly owned store, and then you exchange those for consumer goods. So in appearance, it actually looks exactly like money. The average random person on the street would call that money. You get the piece of paper from your work, and then you go and you give it to the guy, and then he gives you a piece of bread. Well, that's money, right? Well, we would say, no, that's not money. Well, why isn't that money then? It's not money in the same sense as money in capitalism, because it can't be invested into production. In Capital, especially Capital Volume 2, Marx has these formulae of how capitalism happens, and he calls them circuits. And he has something called the MCM circuit. That means money to capital to money. So a capitalist has a bunch of money, he invests it into capital, and then it spits out a bigger amount of money. That's an MCM circuit. The reason that these labor vouchers that Marx describes are not money is because they don't have an MCM circulation. That's a bit of a fancy way of saying it, and it requires a little bit of an explanation, but I think you get the point. You could only get the Soviet rubles a couple different ways. You would either work, and you would earn them through work, or you would exchange with consumer products. And Marx says in the Critique of the Gotha program that the labor vouchers can only be used to buy means of consumption, so consumer products. They can't be used to buy means of production. So when people look at, for example, the Soviet Union, and they see, oh, well, they have these pieces of paper that say ruble on them, that must be money. Well, maybe by some definition, but it's clearly not the kind of money that Marx talks about when he talks about money. Because when Marx talks about money, he talks about the type of money that exists in capitalism. In fact, the Soviet ruble was pretty much the type of labor voucher that Marx talks about. When Engels was debating this opportunist named Dühring, who wanted to create these communes, which would use money to trade with each other, Engels said, quote, "In the trading between the commune and its members, the money is not money at all. It does not function in any way as money. It serves as a mere labor certificate. To use Marx's phrase, it is, quote, merely evidence of the part taken by the individual in the common labor, and of his right to a certain portion of the common produce destined for consumption," unquote. Whether the token, which certifies the measure of fulfillment of the quote-unquote obligation to produce, and thus of the earned quote-unquote right to consume, is a scrap of paper, a counter, or a gold coin, is absolutely of no consequence. Neither in exchange between the economic commune and its members, nor in the exchange between the different communes, can gold, which is quote-unquote money by nature, get to realize this its nature, unquote. When we talk about classes, I don't think anyone would claim that a socialist society has a large, functioning capitalist class. Socialism is only a society of workers. The only complication to that, and the only reason that some people might say that socialism has classes, is this. A socialist society has different kinds of workers. You have industrial workers. It also has historically had collective farmers and rural workers, agricultural laborers, and it has intelligentsia, people who don't conduct manual labor, university teachers, managers, clerks, secretaries, what have you. Now, is it fair to call these different classes? Well, personally, I don't think so. I don't think it makes any sense to call these different classes. They're different segments of the working class. The terms in themselves are still useful. But okay, so if these three groups are basically all workers, then isn't this a classless society? Well, in a way yes, and in a way no. So the additional complication is that even though in a socialist society there are no capitalists, there are no people who privately own a factory and they hire workers and they exploit them, there still are ex-capitalists, so people who used to be a capitalist but then they were expropriated. Or you might have people who try to become capitalists, who want to become capitalists, they're counter-revolutionaries, they try to overthrow the socialist society so that they could become a capitalist because the socialist society is hindering them from becoming a capitalist. Criminals, smugglers, black market merchants, what have you. And then you have foreign capitalists. So capitalists who reside in other countries. To understand the Marxist theory of the state, to understand why the state still exists in socialism, is that the conditions that give rise to the state still exist in socialism. And what are those conditions? They are class struggle. Well, how the hell can you have class struggle in a society that doesn't have classes, right? That doesn't make any sense. It's because on the one hand you have struggle between the people who were only recently overthrown, so the people who only recently used to be capitalists, and the other counter-revolutionaries who also want to become capitalists, between those guys and the workers of the country. And then on top of that, you have the foreign powers, the foreign capitalists. The state arises as a result of class struggle, and this can also take the form of military conflict, say between a socialist country and a capitalist country. This is how the Soviets were discussing the issue back in the day. This is Stalin's report on the work of the Central Committee to the 18th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union Bolsheviks in 1939. Quote, "The feature that distinguishes Soviet society today from any capitalist society is that it no longer contains antagonistic, hostile classes, that the exploiting classes have been eliminated, while the workers, peasants, and intellectuals who make up Soviet society live and work in friendly collaboration. It is sometimes asked, we have abolished the exploiting classes, there are no longer any hostile classes in the country, there is nobody to suppress. Hence, there is no more need for the state, it must die away. Why then do we not help our socialist state to die away? Why do we not strive to put an end to it? Is it not time to throw out all this rubbish of a state? Or further, the exploiting classes have already been abolished in our country. Socialism has been built in the main. We are advancing towards communism. Now, the Marxist doctrine of the state says that there is to be no state under communism. Why then do we not help our socialist state to die away? Is it not time we relegate the state to the Museum of Antiquities? These questions show that those who ask them have conscientiously memorized certain propositions contained in the doctrine of Marx and Engels about the state, but they also show that these comrades have failed to understand the essential meaning of this doctrine, that they have failed to realize in what historical conditions the various propositions of this doctrine were elaborated, and, what is more, that they do not understand present-day international conditions, have overlooked the capitalist encirclement, and the dangers it entails for the socialist society." Unquote. Quote, "The function of military suppression inside the country ceased, died away, for exploitation had been abolished. There were no more exploiters left, and so there was no one to suppress. In place of this function of suppression, the state acquired the function of protecting socialist property from thieves and pilferers of the people's property. The function of defending the country from foreign attack fully remained. Consequently, the Red Army and the Navy also fully remained, as did the punitive organs and the intelligence service, which are indispensable for the detection and punishment of the spies, assassins, and wreckers sent into our country by foreign espionage services. The function of economic organization and cultural education by the state organs also remained, and was developed to the full. Now the main task of our state inside the country is the work of peaceful economic organization and cultural education. As for our army, punitive organs, and intelligence service, their edge is no longer turned to the inside of the country, but to the outside, against external enemies. But development cannot stop there. We are going ahead towards communism. Will our state remain in the period of communism also? Yes, it will, unless the capitalist encirclement is liquidated, and unless the danger of foreign military attack has disappeared. Naturally, of course, the forms of our state will again change in conformity with the change in the situation at home and abroad. No, it will not remain and will atrophy if the capitalist encirclement is liquidated and a socialist encirclement takes its place. That is how the question stands with regard to the socialist state." Unquote. Marx says, quote, "Heroic party comrades in Paris, if they are defeated, only their good nature will be to blame. They should have marched at once on Versailles. The right moment was missed because of conscientious scruples. They did not want to start the civil war, as if that mischievous abortion Thiers had not already started the civil war with his attempt to disarm Paris. Second mistake, the Central Committee surrendered its power too soon to make way for the Commune." Unquote. So in fact, Marx was criticizing the revolutionary proletariat of the Paris Commune for being too soft and not acting decisively enough to militarily crush the forces of Versailles. And to this Engels adds, quote, "A revolution is certainly the most authoritarian thing there is. It is the act whereby one part of the population imposes its will upon the other part by means of rifles, bayonets, and cannon, authoritarian means. And if the victorious party does not want to have fought in vain, it must maintain this rule by means of the terror which its arms inspire in the reactionists. Would the Paris Commune have lasted a single day if it had not made use of this authority of the armed people against the bourgeois? Should we not, on the contrary, reproach it for not having used it freely enough?" Unquote. People might be asking, well, isn't it weird that the Soviet Union still had a state, or that the Soviet Union still had a military? But Marx and Engels clearly understood the necessity of militarily defending the revolution. But before we dive any further into the topic of the state, we're going to have to take a little detour to discuss something called the transitional period. So CuckPhilosophy first makes this argument that for Marx, communism begins right after capitalism, and it doesn't make any sense to talk about socialism, which would then develop into communism.
There are several crystal clear indications that Marx does not distinguish between socialism and communism as stages in a single development.
But it really doesn't make any sense because precisely in the critique of the Gotha program, Marx talks about lower stage communism, which these days we call socialism, and then higher phase communism, which these days we simply call communism. So he cites critique of the Gotha program, but it's precisely in the critique of the Gotha program where Marx talks about the lower stage, also known as socialism, and then the higher stage, known as communism.
In critique of the Gotha program, he writes, "What we have to deal with here is a communist society, not as it has developed on its own foundations, but on the contrary, just as it emerges from capitalist society, which is thus in every respect, economically, morally, and intellectually, still stamped with the birthmarks of the old society from whose womb it emerges." If communism was something that only develops after a long period of the development of socialism, this quote would not make sense.
I feel like you really haven't understood what he's saying. He's saying the first stage of communism, also known as socialism, comes after capitalism. And this lower stage is still in many ways stamped with the birthmarks of the old society. Later, slowly, gradually over time, it develops to the higher stage, which in the modern lingo we call full communism or just communism. And then later on, CuckPhilosophy says that Lenin's narrative of the situation is still fundamentally correct.
Lenin's narrative is still, in essence, Marx's narrative, with merely some terminological changes. Both socialism and communism here still refer to moneyless, classless society. The distorted narrative that is popular nowadays only fully emerges after Lenin's death.
So, this is just an all-around strange point. But what he really wants to do is to say that there's this transitional period, which is when the workers take power, they have their own state machine, and socialism hasn't been built yet, and supposedly the state is meant to wither away during the transitional period, so by the time we get to socialism, the state should already be gone. And there are several reasons why that doesn't make any sense. For instance, so CuckPhilosophy says that Lenin's narrative is correct. Well, okay, this is what Lenin says. Quote, "Until the higher phase of communism arrives, the socialists demand the strictest control by society and by the state over the means of labor and the measure of consumption," unquote. So obviously, in Lenin's opinion, the state still exists. And Marx says, quote, "The question then arises, what transformation will the state undergo in communist society? In other words, what social functions will remain in existence there that are analogous to present state functions?" And then he criticized the Gotha program, saying, quote, "Now, the program does not deal with this, nor with the future state of communist society," unquote. So they're both talking about a state in the lower stage of communism, also known as socialism. But we'll get into that in more detail a little bit later. The logical reason why the state can't wither away during the transition period is that during the transitional period, private property still exists, classes still exist. Only after the transition period, when socialism has been built, private property has been abolished, only then we can even start to talk about the withering away of the state. And then by the time we get to the higher stage of communism, or full communism, that is when the state can finally completely wither away. So Lenin says, quote, "The state will be able to wither away completely when society adopts the rule from each according to his ability to each according to his needs," which is the maxim of the higher stage of communism. As Marx says, quote, "In a higher phase of communist society, after the enslaving subordination of the individual to the division of labor, and therewith also the antithesis between mental and physical labor, has vanished, after labor has become not only a means of life, but life's prime want, after the productive forces have also increased with the all-around development of the individual, and all the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly, only then can the narrow horizon of bourgeois right be crossed in its entirety, and society inscribe on its banners, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs." But like I said, we'll return to the topic of the state in more detail a bit later.
If both lower phase and higher phase communism is stateless,
as I just demonstrated, they obviously are not.
What about the measures in the Communist Manifesto? Since they demand centralization and nationalization in the hands of the state, they obviously presuppose the state. And because they also demand a certain form of taxation, they presuppose money. And so all the other elements that communism, whether lower or higher phase, is supposed to do away with. Well, these are not measures for the establishment of the socialist mode of production itself. That is nowhere said.
He's actually completely correct about this one. I actually have a video of my own called Libertarians Simply Don't Understand the 10 Planks of Communism, where I go through all 10 of those points and explain that they were simply immediate progressive measures for the mid-1800s, but don't actually describe what a socialist society looks like. But this is still a little bit of a straw man or a little bit of a red herring, because we don't base our opinion that socialism has a state on these 10 points. We think that socialism has a state simply because it makes sense, and because Marx, Engels, and Lenin outright say that.
As the common narrative goes, I thought that you have capitalism, then socialism is established when the working class seizes state power, and then after a long period of development, you finally have communism. Well, Marx clearly states, for example, in Critique of the Gotha program, that
between capitalist and communist society, there lies the period of revolutionary transformation of one into the other. Corresponding to this is also a transition period in which the state can be nothing but the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat.
The thing you're not taking into account about that quote is that when Marx says that capitalism transforms to communism, the lower stage of communism is smack in the middle of that. It's not at the end of that. So we start with capitalism, then the workers take over, they create their own power, so the dictatorship of the proletariat, then they build socialism, during which the dictatorship of the proletariat still exists, but now can begin to wither away, and then finally you get to the higher phase of communism, at which point the dictatorship of the proletariat can completely wither away. Maybe this is hard to understand, so I'm gonna draw you guys a picture. And yes, I'm using paint, whatever. It'll do the trick. Capitalism, socialism, communism. So look, in capitalism, they have their dictatorship of capital. Then, workers take over. They establish some kind of worker-controlled state capitalist regime or whatever. This is basically the transition period. This is when the workers are in power, but they haven't built socialism yet. So that's why it falls under dictatorship of the proletariat. Then they build socialism, which is still during the dictatorship of the proletariat. Then it begins to wither away, and when you get to full communism, it's gone. There's no state anymore. Yeah, it's not a very good graph, but I hope it communicates the idea. The problem with this whole transition period argument is that it acts like the transition just happens before any kind of socialism is built, and then when socialism / lower phase of communism is built, there's no transitioning of any kind anymore. But in reality, when Marx says that there lies a period of revolutionary transformation from capitalism to communism, he doesn't just mean between capitalism and low communism. Remember, lower phase of communism is still in many ways stamped with remnants of capitalism. It's still part of that process of transformation. And generally my problem with this whole argument is that it is simply an attempt to make an alternative reading of Marx and to reinterpret what Marx is saying, but it's not actually what Marx is saying. Marx never actually argues in CuckPhilosophy's favor. He's just able to take a few things out of context or take a few things that Marx says which are vague enough that he can impose a new alternative meaning on them, but nowhere does Marx actually explicitly make these arguments that CuckPhilosophy is making. In fact, Marx doesn't agree with CuckPhilosophy, as Marx, Engels, and Lenin all believed that the state still existed in socialism.
Indeed, if one argued that the dictatorship of the proletariat is socialism, or in Marx's terminology, lower phase communism, one would be led into the absurd claim that the transition from capitalism to communism is communism.
Yeah, but this is a straw man because we're not saying that the dictatorship of the proletariat literally is socialism. We're simply saying that the dictatorship of the proletariat still exists during socialism. How could the dictatorship of the proletariat even be socialism when it's not even an economic mode of production? The dictatorship of the proletariat is just a type of state. Just like nobody says that dictatorship of capital is capitalism. Dictatorship of capital is simply the type of state that the capitalists have. Just like the dictatorship of the proletariat is the type of state that proletarians have. The economic mode of production, capitalism, state capitalism, socialism, communism, those are different, they're economic modes of production. So the proletariat takes power, it establishes a dictatorship of the proletariat, then it builds socialism, and then the dictatorship of the proletariat begins to wither away, and in full communism, the higher phase of communism, it finally completely withers away, as Marx, Engels, and Lenin say.
First, you have capitalism. Then the workers seize power. This is the transitionary period, or the dictatorship of the proletariat. The state, markets, and classes, in other words, capitalism, still exist, merely with the working class now in power. The process begins to vanquish classes. Once the working class has defeated the bourgeoisie, lower phase communism is established and has no states, no money, and no classes, but still has material incentives for work.
And at this point, we obviously know he's wrong, because, for instance, this is what Lenin says in State and Revolution, which ironically CuckPhilosophy himself cites, but he obviously didn't read it very carefully. So Lenin says, quote, "This is a defect, says Marx, but it is unavoidable in the first phase of communism. There still remains the need for a state, which, while safeguarding the common ownership of the means of production, would safeguard equality in labor and in the distribution of products. For the state to wither away completely, complete communism is necessary." Unquote. And Marx, in the Critique of the Gotha program, mentions a state in the future communist society, although he obviously means the lower phase of communism, that is, socialism. So we know CuckPhilosophy is wrong about this. But why does he hold the opinion that he does? What reason has he given? Well, he said the state is bad, and that the state is alienating, and he said that capitalism is transformed to communism in a dictatorship of the proletariat, and really, that's all. He hasn't given a quote by Marx where Marx says, in lower phase of communism there's no state, or any of this stuff. There isn't actually any good reason why he should hold that opinion. There is no actual good reason why he should think every other Marxist is wrong. It's all based on a logical misunderstanding. He thinks that because in socialism the capitalist class has been abolished, therefore the state must already have completely withered away, when in reality it simply means that now the state can begin to wither away. The state can't wither away in the transition period because private property and capitalists still exist during the transitional period. The withering can only begin, for the first time, in socialism and is completed in communism.
The development of Marxist thought did not end with the first release of the Communist Manifesto. At that point, one of the most important developments in Marxist thought was yet to come. In 1871, something happened which changed Marx's entire thinking about the state.
Now, the reason he says that is because there's this idea that in the 1870s, because of the Paris Commune, Marx supposedly changed all of his opinions about the state, and everything he wrote before 1871 can then just be ignored. In my opinion, Marx didn't completely change all of his positions on the state. However, he did draw lessons from the Paris Commune, and the main lesson of the Paris Commune was that the workers can't just take over a bourgeois state, they have to smash the bourgeois state and create their own state. And the Paris Commune mainly gave socialists some idea of what a dictatorship of the proletariat could look like in practice. But regardless, CuckPhilosophy makes this argument that in 1871, Marx completely changed his mind about everything, so everything written before 1871, including the Communist Manifesto, can be ignored and doesn't prove anything. However, that doesn't really matter, because everything that I have cited so far was written well after that, and in fact, I've largely been citing the same exact text as CuckPhilosophy himself.
Further, in the original manifesto, Chapter 3 contained the statement that in Germany it is the task of the really revolutionary party to carry through the strictest centralization.
It's not from the Communist Manifesto, it's from the address of Marx and Engels to the Central Authority of the Communist League.
After the experience of the Commune, the manifesto was now updated with a footnote renouncing this earlier statement.
That precisely this provincial and local self-government, similar to the American, became the most powerful lever of the revolution, and indeed to such an extent that Napoleon, immediately after his coup d'etat of the 18th Brumaire, hastened to replace it by an administration by prefects, which still exists and which, therefore, was a pure instrument of reaction from the beginning.
That quote is taken out of context because right after that, it continues, quote, "But no more than local and provincial self-government is in contradiction to political national centralization, is it necessarily bound up with that narrow-minded, cantonal or communal self-seeking which strikes us as so repulsive in Switzerland, and which all the South German federal republicans wanted to make the rule in Germany in 1849, unquote. So we shouldn't think that Marx and Engels are here advocating for some kind of federalism or decentralization or complete local autonomy.
In short, the demand for strict centralization was now deemed by Marx and Engels to be based on a misunderstanding.
As Engels says, they're very much against local self-seeking, and in Germany in 1849 that was a big deal, so they were strongly opposed to it, instead advocating for maximum centralization, but later they realized that centralization into the hands of a bourgeois state is not the right way to go. So this quote is not actually advocating for some kind of decentralization or federalism, and it's not in opposition to centralization in general, it's only in opposition to centralization in the hands of the bourgeoisie.
For a more detailed statement, we must go to the text The Civil War in France, written the same year that the Paris Commune was established. It is here that we really see to what extent Marx's views on the state had changed. Marx's emphasis on local self-government is further confirmed when Bakunin asks, the Germans number around 40 million. Will, for example, all 40 million be members of the government? And Marx, in his notes, responds, certainly, since the whole thing begins with the self-government of the Commune. And finally, Engels confirms this when he proposes as one of the points for the program of the German Social Democratic Party, complete self-government in the provinces, districts, and communes through officials elected by universal suffrage, the abolition of all local and provincial authorities appointed by the state.
Let's look at this question of local self-government in a little bit more detail. So Engels says complete local self-government. What does that mean to him? To him, it means the local population elects their own representatives, instead of the local officials just being appointed from the top. So for Marx and Engels, local self-government simply means that the local population gets to elect their own representatives. This is not the Proudhonist idea of decentralization, where there's just a bunch of local collectives and they all do whatever they want, nor is this federalism. In fact, for Marx and Engels, this type of local self-government is not even in contradiction with centralization. So Marx says, quote, "It is generally the fate of completely new historical creations to be mistaken for the counterparts of older and even defunct forms of social life, to which they may bear a certain likeness. The communal constitution has been mistaken for an attempt to break up into federation of small states. The antagonism of the commune against the state power has been mistaken for an exaggerated form of ancient struggle against over-centralization." Unquote. So, while the commune, which was a proletarian state, was struggling against the bourgeois state, it was not engaged in any kind of struggle against so-called over-centralization. Lenin explains this pretty well. He says, quote, "Marx does not speak here at all about federalism as opposed to centralism, but about smashing the old bourgeois state machine, which exists in all bourgeois countries. The opportunist has so much forgotten how to think in a revolutionary way and to dwell on revolution that he attributes federalism to Marx. Federalism as a principle follows logically from the petty bourgeois views of anarchism. Marx was a centralist. There is no departure whatever from centralism in his observations just quoted. Only those who are imbued with the Philistine superstitious belief in the state can mistake the destruction of the bourgeois state machine for the destruction of centralism." Unquote. Marx explains how the commune was supposed to be the form of government for the whole country. So he says, quote, "In a rough sketch of national organization, which the commune had no time to develop, it states clearly that the commune was to be the political form of even the smallest country hamlet. The rural communities of every district were to administer their common affairs by an assembly of delegates in the central town, and these district assemblies were again to send deputies to the national delegation in Paris, each delegate to be at any time revocable and bound by the mandate imperatif, formal instructions, of his constituents. The few but important functions which would still remain for a central government were not to be suppressed, as has been intentionally misstated, but were to be discharged by communal and thereafter responsible agents. The unity of the nation was not to be broken, but on the contrary to be organized by communal constitution." Unquote. So this is what a proletarian government, combining centralism with local self-government, would look like. And I'm sure the most perceptive of you out there have already realized that this is exactly how the Soviet Union was organized. Every village, every town has local assemblies who elect representatives to central towns and to district assemblies, who again select delegates to the national delegation in the capital, in this case Paris, and every delegate could be recalled at any time. The Soviet government was modeled after this. Every village, every town had a Soviet. It would elect representatives. They would send them to the district level. The district would then elect representatives and send them to the Congress of Soviets, the national level, and they could be recalled at any time. Lenin even says, quote, "The Soviets of workers, soldiers, peasants, and other deputies constitute a new type of state. this is a state of the Paris Commune type, unquote. This confusion largely arises from the fact that when people hear local self-government, they imagine that it's purely local, whereas for Marx, there is no contradiction between local and centralized. For Marx, a central government is something that's just out there somewhere in the capital. It's an executive power totally separate from the people, but something like this national delegation that he was planning, something like the Congress of Soviets, for Marx, that wouldn't be a central government in the old way, because while it is in the capital and it is in that way central and centralized, it still consists of delegates of the localities. So it combines complete centralism with complete local self-government, as weird as that sounds.
So if we go by Max Weber's definition of the state, often used by anarchists, which defines the state as a monopoly on violence over a given territory, the dictatorship of the proletariat would arguably not be a state.
So was the Soviet Union not a state then? I think it's quite a stretch to say that there is no difference between Marxism and anarchism, except a simple misunderstanding of definitions. There's two basic reasons why anarchists and Marxists don't agree on the state. The first one is that for anarchists, a society is only free when the individual is free, and since the dictatorship of the proletariat still limits freedom and still suppresses people, mainly counter-revolutionaries and capitalists, therefore it cannot be anarchy. That's pretty basic. And the second reason is that anarchists don't accept a transitional state as a means of transitioning from capitalism to a stateless communist society. Even though Bakunin misrepresents and distorts Marx constantly in Statism and Anarchy, he at least makes it clear that he does not accept the use of a transitional state. And this is what Lenin says in State and Revolution, quote, "The distinction between Marxists and the anarchists is this. The former, while aiming at the complete abolition of the state, recognize that this aim can only be achieved after classes have been abolished by the socialist revolution as a result of the establishment of socialism, which leads to the withering away of the state. The latter want to abolish the state completely, overnight, not understanding the conditions under which the state can be abolished." And that's pretty much it. If anarchists truly accepted that we could have a transitional state, then we could have common ground on that, even though we would still have to settle on the specifics, like what does it look like, how long does it take, etc. This Lenin quote is yet another example of where Lenin says clearly that classes will be abolished as a result of the establishment of socialism, and then the state can begin to wither away. Lenin obviously doesn't think that the state has already withered away when we get to socialism. And also, this idea that the dictatorship of the proletariat is not a state, that's just a weird argument, because that would be saying that withering away of the state is completely pointless since the state is already gone. What's the point of talking about how the state's gonna wither away during the transitional period and how there shouldn't be a state in socialism if there already isn't a state in the dictatorship of the proletariat? So this argument is internally incoherent. But when it comes to the differences in definitions, the anarchist definition doesn't take a class perspective, it takes an individual perspective. So it says the state is a monopoly on violence. Well, of course, the dictatorship of the proletariat is a monopoly on violence, as it disarms all the counter-revolutionaries and the capitalists and the landlords and the imperialists, and the dictatorship of the proletariat holds the monopoly. The Marxist definition obviously has a class perspective, so it says that the state is an instrument that a class uses to repress another class. The dictatorship of the proletariat is still a state under both of those definitions.